Hey there friends, welcome back to the channel. My name's Alex Lokes and today I have a camera review for you. And it's a camera that is historically significant within the history of the camera. The technological advancements, especially as we move from the 60s into the 70s and 80s. And that camera is the Canon AE-1. This is not the AE-1 program, it's much more popular younger sibling, but the camera that really started it all. And for that, we're going to need to go back to the studio. I can talk about the history of the camera, give you a brief tour of the camera, and overview some functionality, and load the film I'm going to shoot today. So I'll see you back here in a few. The company we know as Canon today was formed in 1933 under the name Seikei Kogaku. Their goal to produce a domestically made Leitz Leica 2 copy. So they bought one, stripped it down, and in 1934 produced a prototype camera. A year or so later, the first production Hansa Canon hit the markets and proved quite popular, and was assisted to that position by the inclusion and use of Nippon Kogaku Nikkor optics. Of course, by 1937, there was a desire for them to produce their own optics in-house, and so the Sinar brand lenses began shipping with all Seikei cameras. Of course, during the war, Seikei played a minor role within the Imperial Japanese war effort, and most of their plants escaped the widespread destruction caused by Allied bombing campaigns. This allowed Seikei to become one of the leaders in the economic recovery of Japan in the post-war period. Their rangefinder cameras proved quite popular with the domestic, occupation, and foreign markets. They would rebrand themselves to the more familiar Canon name in 1947. Although, starting in the mid-century, the popularity of single-lens reflex cameras began to rise, and culminated in the 1959 release of the Nikon F, a system SLR based around a bayonet interchangeable lens mount and an entire plethora of accessories, allowing the professional photographer to modify the camera to whatever they needed it to. Canon's response, the Canoflex, came out that same year, although it never was as popular and was not aimed at the professional market. But it did introduce the familiar breech lock system that all Canon manual focus lenses use. The original version was called the R-mount. So in 1964, they improved it to the FL mount with the release of the Canon TX. And the biggest difference was the FL mount allowed for open aperture TTL metering. This mount was further improved with the FD mount released in 1970. Of course, this also came along with Canon's first professional SLR, the F1. Now, cameras like the F1 and the much more manual FTB get a lot of the attention from this era. But there was one interesting camera that was released in 1973, and that was known as the Canon EF. The EF is what I would consider the closest thing to a direct predecessor to the camera that I'm reviewing today. It used a hybrid electromechanical shutter and featured semi-automatic shutter priority auto exposure. You also started to see in the 1970s improvements in semiconductor technology, including the production of microprocessors. And in 1976, Canon leveraged these microprocessors and released the AE-1. The AE-1 was aimed at consumer and student markets and was completely electronic with a microprocessor to drive the shutter priority auto exposure system and also to handle the actual controlling of the shutter itself. This was completely electronic. There was no mechanical backups on this camera. And it also started to see some use of plastics in the construction. Not as much as later cameras in the A series, but it certainly was a start. The AE-1 proved to be an overnight success. It ended up having 1 million units sold before production ceased in 1986, and it also launched the A series of SLRs from Canon. Of course, in 1981, Canon released the much more popular AE-1 program, which featured a full auto exposure, but it also included the A1, the AT1, the AV1, and the much derided AL1. But let's take a closer look at the camera that started the A series. And here it is. This is the Canon AE-1. If you have a picture in your mind of a Canon SLR from the late 70s, early 80s, there's a good chance that it's going to look like the AE-1 or the AE-1 program. It's a functional camera. There's nothing really special about the design or the look of it. It just is a easy to use, simple camera that is more function over form. So let's take a close look at what the camera is all about. Right here at the front, you have your battery compartment. As you can see, mine just stays open, but it still functions fine. This is one of the weak points on the camera itself, but again, you'll probably find some where the door has been broken off, but in this case, the latch has just become loose over time. You also have at the front, you have the lens, and one thing you will notice is that there is no actual lens release on the actual camera body, and I'll get into that a little bit later in the review. You also have at the side, you have your depth of field. Here's the lens lock release, and you have your backlight compensator. You also have a PC sync socket. Up at the top, rewind knob, shutter. This is your self timer. Up here, frame counter, shutter speed, film speed, and a standard hot shoe, and that's your battery check. On the back, nothing really fancy. You got your film advance lever, memo slot viewfinder, and on the bottom, rewind, and then a coupler for an A series power winder. Either the A or the A2 will work on this camera. And that's it. It's really simple. A camera, not a lot of control surfaces, and it does what it needs to. It simply takes pictures. Let's take a closer look at the camera functions. Simplicity is definitely the name of the game when it comes to the AE-1. Canon really didn't want people having to fiddle too much with the camera. You can run this camera in 2 modes. You can run it in shutter priority mode or metered manual mode. And to do that, you simply adjust the aperture ring. So when it's on the click stops here, you are in metered manual mode, and then it's just a match needle inside the viewfinder. And then there's a release lock here, and you set it to A, and then the camera is immediately into shutter priority mode. Your shutter speed dial is here, and you can use that to dial in your speeds that go from 2 seconds to 1/1000th of a second plus bulb mode. Film lever advances here, and there's your shutter release. This doesn't have the Canon squeal, but you know what? It's still a pleasing sounding shutter. Pop open the back, and there you go. You got your cloth viewfinder. Load it, advance. The one thing this camera does need to have is a battery to work, and there is no on-off switch. So if you're not using the camera, keep that battery out so that you don't drain it and waste a very expensive 4LR44 battery. And then the lens release is here on the new FD style, and it's a collar lock. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later. But that's it. The camera itself, other than that, functions fairly normally. You pick it up, you point it, you shoot it, and you're good to go. Okay, let's get some film loaded and get out into the field. Okay, so today I am here in Oakville, Ontario at the McCraney Valley Creek Trail, an absolutely beautiful spot behind Sheridan College's Trafalgar Road campus. And today I'm going to be shooting Ilford Delta 100 rating it at ASA 100 and developing it in Fomadon LQN. I'll be shooting the 28mm lens and eventually the 135mm lens. So let's head down into the valley, take on the trail, and I'll talk about my experience with the AE-1. Let's go. There is a delightful simplicity about the AE-1. There's no quirks or tricks on using the camera. If you've used an SLR before, you can take it out and start using it right away without reading the manual. But I always recommend giving it a skim before taking it out into the field. With all this simplicity, the one thing I'm surprised is that Canon didn't include the quick load system like their previous generations of SLRs. Another thing to note, there's no on-off switch, and the battery must be installed for the camera to work. The trouble is that when there's a battery in there, the camera is always drawing power. Even putting a lens cap on the lens won't prevent it from drawing power. So if you're not using the camera, keep the battery out and always make sure to carry a couple spares with you. One thing that also surprises me is that there's a bit more weight behind the AE-1 than I expected, but nothing too bad. The handling is excellent, with the control surfaces well within reach, and they all have excellent feedback. One of the best parts is that my copy does not have the typical squeal of the era. Well, that means it's probably been well lubricated. The shutter release and sound, however, are still pleasing. The film advance is a short throw, allowing for rapid shooting, and really making the addition of that 2 frames per second power winder really unnecessary. The viewfinder, surprisingly bright for a consumer camera. Focusing is easy thanks to a split prism, and the metered aperture is clearly indicated. The one thing I don't like, however, is that there is no mirroring of what your selected shutter speed is. However, it is a shutter priority camera, so I can assume that the designers felt that that feedback wasn't needed. At least the speed selector dial is right by your thumb, allowing for easy adjustment, and you just sort of tip it down and you can see what shutter it's set to. Overall, the AE-1 is an excellent camera. The meter is superb and I've never had a bad exposure. But there's really nothing special about the camera. There's no gimmick. It's just, you use it right, you get a good photo. Perfect for those getting into photography, especially the film medium, who want a little bit more automation in their creation process. But what helps improve the AE-1 is the Canon optics. Canon optics are fairly new within the world of photography, but they certainly are some of the best in the manual focus range. And the AE-1 works perfect with any FD or new FD lens. So let's head back to the studio. I'll talk a little bit about the difference between the original and the new version of the mount, and discuss the lenses that I have for my AE-1. And I'll see you back on campus. Okay, so let's talk lenses. Canon's FD mount lenses are absolutely spectacular, and because it's a system that's not supported by modern Canon SLRs, there are several that you can have for a good deal on the used market. Some, not all, but that's the same across any camera system that's on the used market today. So first of all, you need to understand that there are 2 flavors of FD mount lenses. There's the original FD mount, and there's the FDN, or new FD mount, that was released in the early 80s. And the nice thing is that there's no difference optically between these two. It's just how the lens itself is mounted on the camera and the methods of locking and unlocking. So let's take a closer look at a pair of 50mm lenses. These are almost exactly identical, but you'll notice that one has an actual button on the lens and one has this collar. And it's the collar ones that are the original FD mount lenses. These were initially released in 1970 with the Canon F1. Now, in the 1980s, they adjusted it so that it was just a little bit easier to get the lens to mount on the camera itself. And it uses a traditional button release. And again, it needed to be on the lens because none of the cameras had a release lock on it. So with the collar lock, you simply put you align up the red dots, and then you twist the collar to the lock position. And then to dismount it, you twist the collar lock in the opposite direction and just remove the lens. Now, this is very difficult to do with one hand, and if you're not used to this, it might take a bit of time to get used to it. So if you do feel it's a bit awkward, I suggest going with the new FD mount lenses. And they simply, again, you align up the red dots, you twist the lens onto the camera body, and you can do it with one hand. And then to release it, you press the release button and you unlock and twist the lens back. Much more familiar, especially if you're coming from a Nikon, Pentax, or Minolta style camera. And it all depends on what you're familiar with. If you are looking for more period appropriate lens for the AE-1, the collar lock ones are the ones that you'd want to get. I personally don't really care. It all depends on the price of the lens. So what lenses should you get? Well, I don't use the Canon FD mount system a lot, so my selection of lens I'm very limited on. But there are three that I really think that anyone getting into the FD mount system should at least have, and that's a wide angle, a normal, and at least a short telephoto. For me, I started with the 28mm f2.8. I love a good wide angle lens, and this lens is just brilliant. It has a nice fast f2.8 aperture, so it's great for low light situations indoor or dull lights outside. But even stop down, it produces a brilliant image, and it's just really versatile when I just want to go out, shoot architecture, shoot street, shoot travel stuff. Really don't need to worry. The second lens, of course, is the 50mm f1.8, the nice thrifty 50. These things are fairly cheap on the used market. Of course, you can step it up a little bit. Like in my case, I use the SC, or has a special coating on it. You can also get this in SSC, or super spectral coating, but you'll have to pay a little bit more. Again, nice fast f1.8 aperture, great as a cheap portrait lens, great for close-up, great for indoor low light. Nice knockabout general carry around lens. Really, it's the one lens you should start with the camera. And then if you want to go a little bit faster, you of course have access to the f1.4 version, but it's a little bit more on the used market. The third lens I have in my kit is the 135mm f3.5. Now, Canon produced various apertures of this focal length. The 3.5 is the cheapest, but it's by no means cheap in quality. This produces amazing images, great as a short telephoto for wildlife, if you want to get architectural details, or even as a portrait or street photographer's lens. It's just really nice, great quality, integrated hood. You know, I don't use 135mm that often, but it's under $100 on the used market, so I really can't complain. There are also plenty of good third-party options. I have a Vivitar 70-210mm, second generation copy of it, so just as good. I don't really use it that often, but you know, if you're doing wildlife or sports or events, it gives you that extra range. And the series ones are actually really good optics because they might have the Vivitar name, but they're made by excellent third-party manufacturers in Japan. And again, there are plenty of more FD lenses out there. The problem is these days, a lot of them are being used by mirrorless photographers who are then adapting them and using them for filmmaking. Others are even taking them and completely rehousing the optics in Cinecamera dedicated lens mounts for like all the special focus pulling and the gears and all that nonsense. So some of the more desirable focal lengths, so the 35mm f2, 85mm, they're going to cost you more on the used market. But if you just want a good cheap kit, you can definitely find the lenses that I've mentioned for under $100 on the used market, and they'll do you 90% of the time. Well, I don't know about you, but shooting under these hot, humid conditions makes me long for a nice cold beer, but that'll have to wait because I have to go back to work. The AE-1, I honestly don't believe that it is worth the price that you pay for it on the used market today. For the most part, you're going to end up paying at least $200 and $250. The plus side is you might end up with a very attractive 50mm f1.4 SSC lens, one of the best and fastest 50mm lenses within the FD lineup. It's a wonderful lens, and you're basically buying your AE-1 as a body cap for that lens. But the body itself, you're often looking at $100, $150 for it alone. And for a camera of its type, I think it's just way overpriced on the used market, probably because it's just been hyped so much here on YouTube and other social media channels. You can get similar quality out of far less expensive lenses. But if you have a large selection of FD glass, just want to get into shooting manual and want some manual focus cameras and want something that offers up semi-automatic auto exposure, the AE-1 is fine, and you may still find some good deals online to purchase it at a much more fair price. I don't know, I like it. I'm definitely going to be keeping it. I'm not going to be expanding my lens collection. I'm happy with the 3 lenses I have, and that's really all I need. It'll probably end up being used for future film reviews. I know next year I'm going to be reviewing all 3 lenses I have as part of the optical review blogs that I've been doing. So keep an eye on my blog for that. And how about you? Which A-series Canon do you like? Are you AE-1, AE-1 program? Do you go with the A1 or even the more obscure AT and AV versions of the camera? Let me know in the comments, and if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, hit that bell notification icon, and give me a thumbs up. Until next time, my name's Alex Laux. Get out there, stay safe, shoot what you love, on what you love, with what you love. Don't give in to the hype.